The line that lands hardest in any political hearing is the one that changes what the room thinks it's watching. And in this scenario, it happens in a single breath when J.D. Vance steps into the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee as if he belongs there. It's not the usual choreography of prepared statements and timed questions, not the kind where everyone already knows which clip is getting posted before dinner. It's the kind of moment that makes staffers stop tapping their phones because now the script might not be theirs anymore. And when the vice president speaks like he's reading from something heavier than talking points, you can feel the air tighten even before anyone understands why. That's the trick of power in Washington. The room reacts first, and the facts, whatever they are, arrive second. At the witness table sits Ilhan Omar, who in this telling has been delivering the kind of testimony that plays well to sympathetic senators and cable news producers. She's been talking about humanitarian strain, regional instability, and America's moral obligations abroad, with the practiced rhythm of someone who's done this dance. Some members look supportive, others look politely impatient, and most look like they're thinking about the next vote. The hearing, by all appearances, is moving along in the safe lane. Serious topic, familiar arguments, predictable friction. Then the back doors open, and the safe lane disappears. The vice president isn't alone, which is what turns curiosity into alarm. He arrives flanked by Christopher Wray and Scott Bessent, and the optics read less like drop-in and more like presentation. People in Washington love to pretend they don't care about optics, right up until the day optics walk into the room wearing a suit and carrying a binder. The cameras swing in a way that tells you every producer in the country just whispered, "We've got something." And the witness, whatever she expected that morning, clearly didn't expect this. The chair, Jim Risch in this scenario, does what chairs do when reality threatens procedure. He reaches for the gavel and the rulebook at the same time. He calls it irregular because irregular is the Senate's polite word for who authorized this. But the vice president doesn't argue about Senate etiquette because he's not there to win a parliamentary debate. He frames it as disclosure, as due diligence, as something the committee should know before acting on recommendations. And that's where the room starts hearing a different kind of testimony than the one they scheduled. In the story you gave me, the vice president points to personal money transfers, numerous, repeated, and patterned in a way that would make any compliance officer sit up straight. He presents them as documents, as records, as things with dates and amounts that don't care about anyone's press strategy. He implies a destination and a recipient, and then he implies something far more radioactive, that a private financial trail might intersect with sanctioned or extremist-linked networks. Notice the structure, because it matters for how these confrontations work. First the paper, then the insinuation, then the demand for explanation. It's not a conviction in a courtroom. It's a narrative grenade in a hearing room. He says the committee is being asked to endorse larger flows of assistance and influence, while the witness allegedly has undisclosed personal ties that could distort her posture. That's not the same as proving wrongdoing, but it's a powerful suggestion because it pulls the moral rug out from under the testimony. The implication is that a public plea for humanitarian support might be shadowed by private obligations, private loyalties, or private entanglements. And once that implication is on the table, every sentence the witness spoke earlier gets replayed in people's heads with a question mark stapled to it. The room doesn't need a verdict to feel the narrative shift. It just needs doubt with paperwork. Then comes the escalation. Claims of a long investigation, multi-agency work, and tracing funds through informal transfer systems. When officials say, "We traced it," that phrase is doing a lot of heavy lifting, because most people don't know what tracing actually means in messy cross-border contexts. Is it a clean chain, or a mosaic of inferences, or a patchwork built from intermediaries and probability? That's exactly where an investigative-style commentator can lean in without declaring anyone guilty. What is being claimed? What is being shown? And what remains unproven? Because in real life, the gap between "we suspect" and "we can prove" is where reputations go to get mangled. The witness, in your narrative, tries to explain the transfers as family support, which is both plausible on its face and politically combustible in practice. Lots of people send money to relatives abroad for reasons that have nothing to do with politics, ideology, or anything sinister. But public office changes the math, because the public expects not only clean hands but also clean-looking hands. If you're on committees dealing with foreign policy and security, you don't get the luxury of saying, "It's personal," and having that end the discussion. In this kind of drama, "it was family" isn't a shield. It's the start of a new line of questioning. The vice president, as you wrote him, does what prosecutors do in movies. He turns family into conflict. He suggests the witness should have known more, asked more, disclosed more, or stepped back from decisions that touched the same region and networks. He doesn't have to say "criminal" to make the room hear "problem." And because the hearing is public-facing, amplified by C-SPAN in your scene, the witness isn't just answering senators, she's answering the entire country's suspicion reflex. That's the real trap. Even if the explanation is innocent, the audience is trained to assume the opposite when officials walk in holding binders. At this point, the story introduces another ingredient that always spikes the temperature: claims of intercepted communications. Intercept claims are uniquely potent because the public can't independently verify them, and officials can hide behind sources and methods. That makes them perfect for insinuation and terrible for transparency, which is why people either believe them instantly or dismiss them instantly. So the fair question becomes, what is actually being quoted, what is being summarized, and what is being implied by selective excerpts? Because in American politics, summaries are where meaning gets managed. You also wrote in a voting record component where policy positions are reframed as evidence of motive. That move is common because it feels intuitive. If someone voted a certain way and also had personal connections, people assume the vote was corrupt. But votes can be ideological, strategic, constituency-driven, or simply consistent with a worldview that others dislike. So the more responsible way to narrate that segment is to ask what the votes actually represented at the time, what alternatives existed, and whether the record truly shows intent or just correlation. Otherwise, you're not analyzing. You're reverse engineering guilt from politics, which is how half the city makes a living. The witness, in your version, responds by arguing she's being targeted, pointing to bias and political retaliation. And here's where the story becomes a classic Washington collision: paper versus perception, procedure versus power, identity versus institutions. When someone says, "This is targeting," the audience splits. Some hear a credible warning. Others hear an evasive maneuver. The most honest framing isn't "she's right" or "she's lying," but rather, what incentives do both sides have to shape this into a cultural spectacle? Because incentives are the real currency in this town, even when the conversation pretends it's about morality. Then comes the part of your narrative that's the most explosive and also the most precarious to present responsibly: the claim of proof about private family relationships and past immigration issues. In your text, a scientific-sounding report is introduced as if it resolves an old controversy with finality. But in any real-world scenario, the details would matter: what was tested, how it was obtained, what warrants existed, what labs were used. what error rates apply, and what the legal challenges would be. Without those details, the report functions as a prop in a political drama, which may be exactly how it's being used in the scene. So the sharper way to tell it, without accusing anyone as a matter of fact, is to present it as a claim being wielded for maximum impact and ask why it's being unveiled in that forum, at that time. Because, ask yourself, if you truly had ironclad evidence of serious violations, why unveil it like a rating stunt inside a committee hearing? Why not handle it through the channels that exist precisely to avoid political contamination? Is the answer that those channels failed, or that the public theater is the point, or that the leak-proof route is impossible in an election climate? Those questions don't exonerate anyone, but they do expose the machinery behind these spectacles. And once you start seeing the machinery, you can't unsee it. Your narrative also stacks additional allegations: tax issues, campaign spending issues, consulting payments, the whole familiar web that modern audiences have been trained to expect. That stacking is dramatically effective because it overwhelms the listener's ability to separate the plausible from the proven. It's the where there's smoke tactic, except smoke can come from a fireplace or a burning building, and the storyteller wants you to assume the latter. So if you want this to land as hard commentary rather than reckless assertion, you treat each claim like a file folder that might contain something real, might contain something exaggerated, and might contain something selectively framed. And you keep asking, which parts are documentary? Which parts are interpretation? And which parts are simply theater dressed as documentation? The senators in your scene react in predictable lanes, some outraged, some cautious, some opportunistic. You name Lindsey Graham, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Tom Cotton, and Chuck Grassley as voices that press hard, and that tracks with the kind of drama this setup is built to produce. On the other side, you include Ben Cardin, Chris Murphy, and Chris Coons as Democrats wrestling with a dilemma: defend a colleague or defend the institution's credibility. That's a real tension in American politics because loyalty is currency until it becomes liability, and then it's a hot potato. In this kind of moment, you can almost hear the internal math. What's the cost of standing by her? And what's the cost of abandoning her? And here's where your request to add personal viewpoint becomes a practical shield. A native-sounding American commentator can say, "I'm watching this and I don't know what's true yet, but I know what this looks like." You can say, "If those documents are authentic, that's a problem. If they're incomplete, that's a different problem." Either way, the public is being asked to decide on vibes. You can point out the asymmetry. Officials get to imply certainty while withholding key details, and the witness is expected to refute a mountain in real time with a teaspoon. You can note that this is how reputations are destroyed in the modern era, by compressing complex claims into a single viral exchange. And you can do it without declaring anyone guilty, because you're critiquing the process and the incentives, not issuing a verdict. The middle of your story leans into institutional escalation, with talk of referrals, ethics action, emergency votes, and leadership statements, including Mike Johnson. In a dramatized political narrative, those moves give the audience the sensation of inevitability, like dominoes falling. But inevitability is often just momentum, and momentum can be manufactured when cameras are rolling and people sense blood in the water. So the skeptical narrator's job is to slow it down. What actually happened? What is being claimed happened? And what is being inferred because it makes a cleaner story? In other words, are we watching accountability, or are we watching a conversion of allegations into entertainment? Your text later brings in progressive figures creating distance, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders. That move is narratively satisfying Because it signals abandonment, and abandonment signals guilt to the casual viewer even if none has been legally established. But it's also politically realistic, because movements protect themselves by cutting off anyone who might contaminate the brand. The irony is that brand management behavior can look like moral clarity even when it's just strategic self-preservation. So a sharp American voice can say, "Watch how fast principles turn into press statements when the risk hits the donor spreadsheet." From there, your story goes into detention, legal strategy, long-term consequences, and eventual exile, which is where things can easily cross from edgy commentary into firm, factual accusation. To keep it safe and still gripping, you frame the entire latter half as a speculative projection. If the claims hold, here's the kind of downstream collapse that often follows. You talk about how public scandal can become social isolation, how a political identity can become a liability overnight, how friends vanish when the phones stop ringing. You can add dry American-style cynicism, how Washington loves a morality play because it lets everyone pretend corruption is rare, when really it's the city's climate. And you keep using conditional language: could, might, appears, raises questions, so you're never stating the worst claims as settled truth. If I were voicing this as a political commentator, my personal take would be blunt. The most unsettling part isn't even the allegations themselves. It's the method. When leaders choose a hearing room for a high-drama reveal, they're telling you the audience is part of the strategy, not just a bystander. They're banking on the fact that most viewers don't distinguish between presented and proven, between suggested and established. And they're betting the target will either freeze, lash out, or reach for a broad defense that doesn't address the specifics. That's not justice. That's a stress test of optics. At the same time, it's also fair to say the reverse. If even a portion of the documents were authentic and properly obtained, then the public has a right to ask why the oversight mechanisms didn't catch conflicts earlier. Why is this surfacing now, in this way, with this cast of characters, and not through the quieter channels that exist to avoid politicization? Was it buried? Was it ignored? Was it withheld until the timing was optimal? Or was it rushed because someone feared it would leak? Every option points to a system that rewards spectacle over clarity, and that's the part that should make viewers uneasy, regardless of which side they're on. What makes a scene like this linger isn't the paperwork or the posturing, it's the fact that everyone in the room understands the same ugly truth at the same time. Once the accusation is said out loud, the old hearing is dead. The original topic, aid levels, humanitarian corridors, diplomacy, becomes background noise, because the only question that matters now is whether the audience believes the binder or the witness. And in Washington, belief is often a faster process than verification, because verification takes time and belief takes one camera close up. You can watch senators recalibrate in real time, not as humans searching for truth, but as politicians calculating splash damage. If you ever wondered why Americans say nothing is real anymore, this is the kind of moment they're talking about. The vice president's posture in your narrative isn't rage, it's calm, and that calm is doing half the work. Anger invites rebuttal. Calm reads like confidence, and confidence reads like, "We've already checked the receipts." Even if you don't know whether the receipts are complete, the tone signals that the people holding them want you to assume the hard part is already done. That's why the witness's first instinctive reaction, trying to label it as targeting, lands with part of the room and bounces off the other part. The room isn't asking, "Is this fair?" It's asking, "Is this specific?" And specificity is a weapon. But here's the part that a lot of viewers miss when these hearings go viral. Specificity can be curated. A stack of documents can be real and still be framed in a way that exaggerates what it proves. A chart can be accurate and still be presented without the context that would shrink its implications. Tracing can mean we followed a clean chain, or it can mean we inferred a path through a messy network, and the public usually can't tell which one is being claimed. That's why the smartest stance for a commentator isn't to pick a side instantly. It's to slow the clip down and ask what the clip is designed to make you feel. When officials invoke informal transfer systems, Hawala, Hala, and other networks that sit outside the tidy world of U.S. banking, people's imaginations fill in the blanks. Those systems are real, they're complicated, and they can be used for everything from remittances to wrongdoing, sometimes in the same neighborhood on the same afternoon. So if someone says money moved through one of those networks, the fair question is whether they're describing a proven route or a plausible route. What's the standard of proof they're leaning on, and what's the standard they want the public to assume? Because the difference between "this raises concerns" and "this proves intent" is the difference between commentary and conviction. Now, the senators who smell opportunity do what they always do. They turn a foggy allegation into a clean political slogan. They don't ask questions to learn. They ask questions to carve out a clip where the witness looks evasive. And the witness, under that pressure, is tempted to answer emotionally, because emotion feels like defense when you're cornered. But emotion is also gasoline for your opponents, because it lets them say, "See, she's not denying it, she's deflecting." That's the trap. The more she insists on motive, the more they insist on mechanics. If you want the scene to stay sharp without crossing into outright accusation, the safest lane is to keep the spotlight on contradictions. Why is this being presented here and now, rather than through quiet legal channels? Why does it require a televised ambush to disclose what supposedly took 18 months to build? Why is the committee being asked to absorb complex financial intelligence claims in the span of a few minutes like it's a pop quiz? And if the evidence is as strong as the officials imply, why do they need the spectacle at all? Because spectacle changes the rules. It moves the audience from what happened to who won, which is the most American impulse we have in politics. It also changes what the witness can realistically do. She can't subpoena. She can't cross-examine. She can't bring expert rebuttals. She can't show the missing pages. All she can do is speak, and speaking isn't the same as proving, especially when the other side claims to have the machinery of the state behind it. So the viewer is watching a mismatch, and mismatches are entertaining even when they're unfair. In your narrative, the officials keep widening the frame. Financial transfers, communications, voting records, tax questions, campaign questions, until it starts to feel like an avalanche. That's another classic tactic. You don't need any single piece to be definitive if you can pile enough pieces to create inevitability. It's the same reason conspiracy theories work, ironically. They overwhelm people with dots until the audience draws a line that feels obvious. But obvious is not the same as accurate, and inevitability is often a sensation crafted by volume. So a responsible commentator keeps asking, which claim stands alone? And which claim depends on stacking assumptions? The moment the story introduces anything that sounds like scientific certainty, lab results, probabilities, forensic language, the stakes go nuclear. Because science has cultural authority, even when it's being summarized by people with political incentives. A document can be real and still be interpreted misleadingly, and most viewers won't know how to interrogate it. They'll hear federal lab and assume the debate is over, the way people hear national security, and stop asking follow-up questions. That's why, in your voiceover style, the smartest move is to keep saying some version of, If this is verified, it's devastating. If it's not, then the method of presenting it is its own scandal. The hearing itself becomes a stage for something else, a test of institutional trust. Do you trust the witness to explain the paper, or do you trust the officials to present it? Do you trust the process, or do you trust the vibe of authority? In a healthier era, you'd say, trust the process. But in modern America, the process is often a synonym for the part you'll never see. So people trust the clip, and the clip is exactly what both sides are trying to own. Even the senators who want to be careful can't escape that gravity. They might call for reviewing everything, for due process, for not jumping to conclusions. And it sounds reasonable for about 10 seconds. Then someone across the aisle says, "So you're fine with this," and the careful senator becomes the next target. That's why the middle collapses so fast in political media moments. The middle is boring, and boring doesn't survive contact with a live camera. If you've ever watched a lawmaker try to thread the needle and still end up bleeding, you're watching that dynamic in action. And while all of this is happening, a quieter but more consequential story is unfolding under the table. The staffers. Staffers are the ones texting leadership, calling legal counsel, checking what's already public, and trying to figure out whether a colleague is about to become radioactive. They're also the ones who know that a single misstep in a public hearing can trigger months of investigations, headlines, and fundraising attacks. So you can imagine the frantic behind-the-scenes questions. What do we say if reporters ask? What do we deny? What do we admit? Do we distance? Do we wait? The witness might be the face of the moment, but the machine is already spinning around her. A sharp narrator can also point out how power uses national security language as a kind of rhetorical disinfectant. Once words like watch list, intercepts, counterterrorism, or designations enter the conversation, everyone is afraid of sounding naive. Nobody wants to be the senator who looks like they're minimizing risk, even if the evidence hasn't been aired in full. That fear becomes leverage, and leverage becomes pressure, and pressure becomes a demand for instant moral clarity. Instant moral clarity is great television and terrible governance, but television tends to win. So when you transition into the next beat of the story, referrals, ethics talk, calls for investigations, the key is to keep the tone skeptical and personal. I'm watching people in that room act like they're defending principles, but I can't ignore how much of it looks like survival instinct. I'm hearing the word facts thrown around like confetti, but facts don't usually arrive as a surprise guest in the middle of testimony. I'm seeing a system that can't resist turning everything into a showdown, because a showdown makes everyone feel righteous, even when the truth is complicated. Those lines carry opinion, they carry edge, and they avoid declaring anyone definitively guilty. Then you can start building the crescendo without making it a courtroom verdict. You describe the witness's dilemma: deny broadly and look evasive, or answer narrowly and risk stepping into a detail trap. You describe the vice president's advantage. He can present selective documents and claim completeness while keeping the audience from seeing the full file. You describe the committee's weakness. It isn't designed to adjudicate complex allegations in real time, but it becomes the venue anyway, because it's televised and symbolic. And you describe the audience's addiction. They don't want nuance, they want a winner. From there, you pivot into the public reaction as a mirror of the broader American fracture. One side says, finally, accountability, and the other side says, this is weaponization. And both sides think they're describing reality. Social media turns the clip into a Rorschach test. If you already distrust the witness, the binder confirms it. If you already distrust the administration, the binder proves abuse. And the saddest part is that the people most confident online usually know the least about what's actually in the file. Confidence is free, verification costs time, and time doesn't trend. You can also fold in subtle humor the American way, with a little bite, but not cruelty. Something like, Washington loves a shock reveal so much, you'd think committees came with a fog machine and a DJ. Or, if binders were truth, Congress would be the most honest place on earth, and we all know that's not how this movie goes. Or, half the people watching don't even care what's in the folder. They just want to see someone squirm like it's a sport. That kind of sarcasm keeps the voice native and sharp, without turning it into personal harassment. Finally, to keep tension high while staying safe, you end this segment on the unresolved question that forces the next chapter. If the allegations are as solid as the officials imply, why risk contaminating them with political theater? If the allegations are not solid, why present them with the confidence of final judgment? And if we've reached the point where hearings are used as public takedown stages, what does that say about how little faith the system has in its own internal safeguards? That's the hook that pulls the viewer forward, because it makes the story bigger than one person. The point isn't to tell the audience what to think, it's to make them feel the unease that comes from watching institutions behave like content factories. It's to say, I'm not here to declare anyone guilty, but I am here to call out how easily America confuses an accusation with a conclusion. And it's to make the viewer ask themselves a question they don't like. If a binder and a camera can redefine reality in minutes, what happens to truth when the incentives reward speed over accuracy? Because that's the real scandal in the background of every viral hearing, even the ones where the target deserves criticism. And once you see that, you start realizing the spectacle isn't a glitch. It's the business model.